Guys, the 2025 season is officially done and over with. Lando Norris ends up taking home the World Drivers' Championship, as well as McLaren taking home the World Constructors' Championship. But this video is not to cover everything that we saw in the 2025 season. This video is to go over some of the predictions that we made before the season even began. We're going to be going over our World Drivers' Championship and our World Constructors' Championship predictions to see how close we were able to get going in and seeing what we saw over 24 races, 6 sprints, and a whole lot of on-track action and drama. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to start with our Constructors' Championship, and then we'll round things out by going driver by driver, where they finished in the championship, where I predicted them before the season began, and we'll see where they ended up when it was all said and done. But let's go ahead without further ado. It's the 2025 results, predictions, reaction. We're not going to go into super in-depth here. We're going to save a lot of my, per team analysis and big picture analysis for my 2025 season in review video that's going to be coming out very shortly. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at our Constructors' Championship. We're going to touch a little bit on why I thought they were going to finish where they finished, and then we'll kind of give a brief overview of what really was the story of the season. We'll give like a little one-liner per team to explain where they ended up and why they ended up where they did. Let's go ahead. Let's jump on into it. I don't think there's any beating around the bush here. We're going through the constructors. Let's start in P10 in the final standings. We have Alpine, the French outfit, who last season actually ended up taking a very sizable, chunk out of the bottom half of the standings. Very quickly established themselves down the stretch of last season as a real, not necessarily contender, but I mean, they had a very solid results last season. And ultimately going into this year, I thought they were going to continue a little bit of that momentum. I actually predicted them to finish P5 this season, mainly just from a lot of the momentum that they seem to have going into the end of the 2024 season. You're probably going to hear this a lot, but alas, it turns out that the car was really bad, and going into their final season being an engine manufacturer, as well as preparing and setting up for the new regulation set in 2026, Alpine decided to take a year off, going through Jack Doohan and Franco Colapinto alongside Pierre Gasly on the way to P10. So got this one quite a bit wrong, unfortunately. Let's go ahead and move on to P9 in the championship. This was Sauber's steak kick a dog F1 team, whatever they're called these days. They're soon to be Audi, but here in 2025, their last season as Sauber, they ended up finishing P9 in the championship. Not too shabby. I predicted them to finish P10. This was a bit of a carryover from the season prior. Obviously with Bottas and Zhou, there was not much to be said there. It really was the worst car on the grid, and kind of along, I made these predictions such a long time ago that I really wasn't expecting to see the results that we really did over the course of 2025. So I thought they were going to be at the back, and while it wasn't necessarily on paper, you look at it and go P9 and P10, not that different, but the way that this went about was very different. You saw Nico Hülkenberg on the podium, and Gabriel Bortoleto put in some really solid results. So P9 at the end of the day, not too shabby, and even then, I still only was one place off in my predictions. Moving on to P8, this ended up being MoneyGram Haas F1 team. That's my team. I actually predicted them to finish P6 this season. I think this was a bit of a homerism pick on my part now that I'm looking back on it. Obviously, last season with Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg in the car, a lot of experience in Formula One in the car. They ultimately, I think, had one of their better seasons in Formula One. Ultimately, obviously, finishing, P7 last season or something like that. It was a very, very successful season, and I think I let that get to my head a little bit. Obviously, we welcomed in Esteban Ocon as well as rookie Ollie Behrman into the car, and this probably should have been a moment to kind of take a step back, look at it in a much bigger picture, and not necessarily assume that they were going to be able to carry that momentum forward quite as such. But hey, nevertheless, P8, not too shabby, had a very successful 2025 season. Moving on to P7 in the championship, this was Aston Martin. I actually predicted Aston Martin to finish P8, but I think this was primarily centered more around the assumption that they were going to tank a lot more than they probably did this season. They had a couple of runs here and there throughout the season to really vault themselves up the order, especially down towards the finale of the season, where they give themselves just a little bit extra here and there to vault themselves up into P7. I assumed they were going to try and secure as much wind tunnel time for Adrian Newey as possible, and alas, they succeeded in this goal. They finished P7, probably without a couple of results down the stretch of the season. I think they probably would have finished P8, but nevertheless, P7 in the championship, not too shabby. They're definitely eyes up on 2026 though. All right, P6 in the championship. I actually went with VCAR, Visa Cash App Racing Bulls, who saw 3 drivers overtake the 2 cars over the course of the season, with Yuki Tsunoda dropping out and being replaced with Liam Lawson, doing a little bit of a swap scene there at the beginning of the season. They ended up finishing P6, very respectable. They had a very solid car. This was another one where I probably undervalued them going into this season. You really didn't know what you were going to get with Hadjar. Obviously, Yuki is a pretty known commodity, but ultimately, I don't think I was expecting Hadjar to be as good as he was. And the V-Car, I probably also was a bit undervaluing here. Coming towards the end of a regulation set, they ultimately decided to build a pretty decent car. Early on in the season, I would argue might have been the 5th fastest car. So it was a very, very good season for VCARB. I think they can be very happy with it. And while I did predict them to finish P9, they absolutely threw this one in my face and proved me very, very wrong. All right, let's move on to P5 in the championship, and we are going to see Williams here, who probably had one of their best seasons in quite a long time, with Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz at the helm. This one actually didn't even finish that far off from where I predicted. Obviously, I think it couldn't have gone any better than it realistically did. I predicted them to finish P7 before the testing began, and ultimately, I think they very much overshot expectations. They did sort of a driver swapsies over the course of the season. Alex Albon came fired out like an absolute cannon at the beginning of the season, securing multiple top 5s in the first handful of races. Carlos Sainz ended up taking up the mantle when Albon started to struggle down the stretch of the season, securing himself a couple podiums actually, and having a really, really good run to finish the season. It vaulted them and secured them P5 pretty comfortably, and so ultimately, Williams, congratulations on a huge season. Next season, all eyes are on you. All right, P4 in the Constructors' Championship. Possibly the most disappointing result in terms of the Constructors' fight. It was, in fact, Scuderia Ferrari. Let's get it out of the way. I did predict Ferrari to win the Constructors' Championship somehow, some way. At the end of the day, this one was... Okay, we're going to go into more detail on this on my season reaction, but I'm just going to tell you a little tidbit here. I don't think this was as far-fetched as a lot of people... Hindsight is 2020 in this instance. Ferrari ended the 2024 season on such a high that I naively assumed they would carry it over. So, nevertheless, I predicted them to win. They ended up P4, a very disappointing season to say the least. We're going to come back to this in our season in review, I promise you that. All right, P3, effectively a one-man army. It is Red Bull Racing. Obviously, Max Verstappen doing a lot of heavy lifting here to lift Red Bull up into the top 3 in the Constructors. I predicted them to finish P4. I think this was an instance where you saw so many other teams finish 2024 sort of on an upswing, and there was a lot of uncertainty going around Red Bull. Obviously, I think this was kind of a very solid prediction. Had Max Verstappen not had a late charge in the Drivers' Championship, who knows if this one might have been bang on. But nevertheless, I was only one position off, but it was a long season for Red Bull with a lot of drama. But ultimately, they did what Red Bull does and found a way to make the car fast and secured themselves a top 3 finish in the Constructors. P2 runner-up in the Constructors' Championship was the Silver Arrows of Mercedes. They finished second here in this one. I predicted them to finish P3. I think this was an instance where going into the end of 2024, I've said it a lot, I'll continue to say it, Ferrari and McLaren just seem to have been separating themselves just enough to really convince me that P3 was probably the best that Mercedes could ask for, especially in an era of regulations that just did not ever seem to gel with them. I think Ferrari was winning races, McLaren was winning races, Mercedes was there to pick up the pieces when things went awry, but it never really looked like they were truly going to be challenging for Constructors. Not that they realistically did this season, but at the end of the day, they overperformed expectations. A rookie in Kimi Antonelli Also, unsure what you're going to get from him, but he ended up performing brilliantly. So, congratulations, Mercedes. You were the runner-up. But alas, there can only be one winner, and boy, oh boy, was there one winner when it comes to the Constructors fight. McLaren ended up taking the Constructors by quite the margin. I did predict them P2. We already kind of covered that when we talked earlier with Ferrari. McLaren, I think, just was ending on a bit of an unknown streak towards the end of last season. The 2024 season was a fascinating finish, especially with how good Ferrari was looking. I assumed they probably would have gone all in on their then philosophy, but alas, no, and McLaren absolutely knocked it out of the park. I think we knew this Constructors was locked up not but a handful of races into the season, so they ended up basically walking away with this one, having it locked up far before the Drivers was. So there we have it, guys, our top 10 teams in order and where I predicted them. The closest I got was a couple of one positions off here or there. Obviously, McLaren, Mercedes, Red Bull, who else? Aston Martin were just one off. I think our farthest apart might be Alpine, who finished 10th, and I predicted to finish P5. So I don't know. I put my hands up. I got a couple of these very wrong, but I wasn't too far off others as well. So let's go ahead. Let's move on now and take a look at our Drivers' Championship positions. But before we get too far, if you're enjoying this video or you enjoyed the 2025 season and following along on our journey covering it, go ahead, hit subscribe down below if you haven't already. We'd love to have you join our little community. And as always, leave a like rating on the video because it really helps me out. All right, we're going to be going through these a lot faster because boy, oh boy, there's a lot of drivers to cover. We're going to be going through the bottom up, starting in what ended up being 21st position and finishing here in P1. I'll give a very brief talk kind of explaining what we saw over the course of the season. I think a lot of the conversation will probably be happening towards the top end of the driver standings, but got to give everyone a little bit of something. But without further ado, we got a lot of drivers to cover. Let's go ahead, start in P21, Jack Doohan. I predicted Jack to finish in P18. He ultimately ended up finishing at the very bottom of the standings. Obviously, this comes with a huge caveat that he only participated in 5 race weekends. So ultimately he did end up finishing 3 spots lower than my prediction at the beginning of the season. I think this was predicated a lot on my assumption about Alpine continuing a lot of momentum and having a pretty decent race car. It turns out they built a very bad race car, and I think it really goes to show because in P20 in the championship, we actually have his person who replaced him, the Argentinian Franco Colapinto, who we are not including here in terms of up or down. My prediction, obviously, I did not predict him to be in the championship. You can't really do that. It really ultimately is unfair a lot to the drivers as well as kind of him in case he doesn't. So ultimately, Franco finishes in P20, had a pretty ho-hum, whatever, kind of just went as Alpine went. Not a whole lot to really say in the grand scheme of things. Moving on to P19 is Gabriel Bortoleto, who actually is finished 1 up from my predictions in P20. This was an instance where obviously, I think kind of what I talked about with the Sauber finish in the Constructors. This doesn't tell the whole story because he really had very good weekends, but there were just other weekends where the Sauber was just not very good and he could not capitalize. And so I think this is nothing to slouch at. Obviously, I think he has a pretty bright future, especially if Audi can give him a semi-competitive race car. We've seen how fast he really can be. As we move on now to P18, we have Pierre Gasly, who I think if I do some basic math, actually we already have our winner for the most positions off in the predictions versus reality. I predicted Pierre Gasly to finish P9 in the championship because, once again, he's really finished 2024 off very well. Obviously, he ousted his former teammate Esteban Ocon, who moved over to Haas. And I think this was an instance where Pierre has shown propensities for being very quick, and ultimately he did end up finishing 9 positions below. But I don't put that on him. I think he did everything he could in an absolute dumpster. So ultimately it is what it is. As we move on now to P17, Yuki Tsunoda, who had one of the more interesting seasons, I think, across 2 teams, starting the first 2 weekends in the V car before moving over to the Red Bull main team for Japan onwards. He had a very tough year, I think he would have benefited from being in the V-Carb the entire season. Would that have saved his race seat? I'm not sure, but ultimately he did end up finishing P17. I predicted Yuki to finish P13. This is, again, predicated on, I think, him being in what turned out to be a very decent RB car. Ultimately, it was not to be. He finishes 4 positions down from where I predicted him. As we move on now to P16, we have Lance Stroll, our first Aston Martin driver, who I predicted to be P16. That's right, my first instance of being spot on. I think this one fits pretty nicely. I think Aston Martin is perfectly positioned to be 4th, 5th, 6th, or apparently 7th in the Constructors, and I think this was a perfect spot for Lance, who, flips the coin when he goes to any race weekend, deciding whether he wants to be there or not. And so P16, definitely a solid position for Lance, and I got a spot on, so we'll take it. As we move on now, my first Haas driver, Esteban Ocon, who, sort of similar to Alex Albon, had a flurry of really good results early on in the season before ultimately fading late in favor of his teammate. Esteban actually was in the top 10 for a lot of this season, but ultimately, just for whatever reason, one thing or another, just kind of fell out of pace and ultimately finishes here in P15. I did predict him to finish in P12. I think this was kind of going back to my Haas delusion syndrome just a smidge. Ultimately, the Haas was not as good as advertised towards the end of last season, and ultimately, I think Esteban is a proof of it for sure. So he finishes 3 down on his position. Next in P14 is Liam Lawson, who I made a prediction based on him being in the Red Bull the entire season, and obviously being a bit better than he was in that Red Bull. I predicted him to finish in P7, and thankfully, thanks to a brilliant RB car, actually saves him from being my largest gap in predictions versus reality. He obviously finishes 7 down because I predicted him P7, he finished P14, so not too shabby. Definitely benefited from a very good V-Carb car down the stretch of the season. As we move on now to Ollie Behrman, who finished P13 this season with a very stellar finish to his season, culminating in a P4 in Mexico. So I predicted Ollie to finish P14, so only 1 off, actually 1 above where I thought he was going to finish. So congratulations, Ollie. You are only my 2nd driver to finish above where I predicted, and you are the GOAT, and please stay forever. As we move on now to Isaac Hadjar, who I think is one of the more underrated drivers of the season, I think is saying something because I think a lot of people do rate him pretty highly, as he now has secured himself a seat in the main team. So ultimately, he came home to finish in P12. I put him in P18 in my predictions, mainly because I just didn't know that much about him. This one's probably on me. I really wasn't sure what to make of this group of rookies. I didn't have high hopes for a lot of them, as is apparent. So he finishes 6 positions up from where I originally predicted him. So good job, Isaac, for proving me wrong. P11 now, we have Nico Hülkenberg, who actually, if I'm looking, secures himself the most incorrect I was going the other way. I predicted him to finish in P19. He comes home to finish P11, 1 spot out of the top 10 for a whopping 8 positions up from where I predicted him. I thought the Sauber was going to be horrific, and for a lot of the season it was, but ultimately Nico Hülkenberg gets himself a podium, so we're going to leave it at that. Moving on to the top 10 now, let's continue to roll through these. Fernando Alonso finishes in P10. I predicted him P11. He finishes 1 position up from where I predicted him. This was another one of those instances where Fernando would every once in a while just have a really, really good weekend, secure himself a lot of points, and he ultimately came home, finished P10 in a season which I'm not entirely sure Aston Martin took as seriously as even some of us assume as of now. Moving on to P9, Carlos Sainz, once again another 1 position off, as I predicted him to finish P10. I think the Williams was shaping up to be a very decent car this season, and I really rate Carlos Sainz as a driver, and so this is an instance where I predicted him in the top 10 in his first season of Williams, and nevertheless, he absolutely nailed it for me. Moving on to P8, we have Alex Albon. This was an instance where I think I let a lot of the talk about Carlos Sainz being the true litmus test for Alex, and he came in and absolutely smashed it out of the park. I predicted Alex to finish P15. This was probably definitely another big oversight on my part. He finishes 7 positions above where I predicted him, so proving me wrong there, Alex. Moving on now to P7, we have Kimi Antonelli. I predicted him P8. I think this was a perfect position for Kimi, the rookie stepping into the Mercedes for the first time in his career in F1. Really not sure what to make of it, and ultimately I thought that experience would win out, and it turns out it did, as he finishes P7 behind a lot of very experienced and very quick drivers in some quick cars. So good rookie season, Kimi. Absolutely nothing to put your head down for sure. Let's move on now to P6. We have Lewis Hamilton, who secures himself a top 6 finish once again. I did predict Lewis to finish in P3. This was a big Ferrari delusion syndrome year for me. I thought Lewis would step into a new car, potentially gel with it relatively quickly, and have some success, but Ferrari decided to do Ferrari things and make it only worse for him. So he finishes 3 positions down from where I predicted him, and it was a long season we're all glad is over if you're a Ferrari fan. Speaking of Ferrari, top 5, let's begin in P5. Charles Leclerc, who once again, let's get it out of the way, predicted Charles Leclerc to win a world championship. This season is proving to me that I am also susceptible to the Ferrari delusion, and we need not speak about it anymore. Let's move on now. Top 4, we have George Russell next. I predicted to finish in P6, so he finishes 2 positions up from where I predicted. This was probably George's best season in Formula One. He routinely was spawning on podiums when there were issues ahead. He was very consistent most times. When Mercedes was half decent, he was there to take advantage. I believe he only lost out to Kimi Antonelli maybe a couple times over the course of the entire season. He was extremely consistent, and that shows with a top 4 finish for the still relatively young driver. We'll see what he can do in a Mercedes next season. But here we go, top 3 time, the championship battle and the championship decider that went all the way down to Abu Dhabi. We begin in P3. We have Oscar Piastri, who ultimately I predicted to be in P4, so he did finish above where I predicted him. I thought this was another season. It's Oscar's 3rd in F1. I thought it was going to be a good season. Let him continue to grow, continue to improve his pace, his management, everything, really get up to speed. And boy, did he, leading the championship actually for 15 rounds, and ultimately fading down to P3 thanks to some unlucky timing of a slump as this season wound down. So absolutely nothing to get too down on Oscar, but I'm sure it's still gonna definitely hurt. But P2, we're coming down to it. Only a couple of drivers remain. The actual, probably if you're gonna really look at it, the final 2 who are truly challenging for the championship, Max Verstappen in P2. I predicted to finish in P5, ultimately finishing 3 positions up from where I predicted, once again proving me incorrect when it comes to Max Verstappen getting the absolute most out of that Red Bull. And boy, oh boy, did he. He ended up leaning outside the championship line by only 2 points in a car that realistically was probably 4th fastest for a majority of this season. So absolutely unbelievable season for Max, and I don't think any of us are too surprised. But ultimately, it was Lando Norris who takes home the World Championship title for the next year. He will get to put the 1 on that car going into 2026, and it was a brilliant way to finish the season for Lando Norris. I predicted him to finish in P2, so last but not least, one driver outperforming my predictions once again. It was a great year for Lando, winning his first championship and McLaren's first championship in quite a long time. But guys, there we have it. My Constructors and World Drivers Championship predictions revisited very quickly. There was a lot of talking there and not a lot really said, but nevertheless, we are going to be going over our full season recap next up on the channel. It's going to be a lot of fun, and then we're going to finish that one out with our final predictions review for the season as we take a look at our full season predictions that we made before testing even began. So it is going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait to get there. Stay tuned for that. If you liked this video and made it this far, subscribe, leave a like on the video. It really helps me out, and leave a comment down below explaining what your biggest gap was between what you expected to happen and what actually did happen on the grid. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one, and I'll see you in the next one.